I don't know why I pulled off the highway at that exit. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe I was on autopilot. Or maybe something wanted me to stop. I had been driving for 10 straight hours, my hands aching from gripping the wheel, the glow of the dashboard clock reading 12:17 a.m. as I rolled into the parking lot of the Claremont Motor Lodge, a rundown roadside motel in Rockingham, Vermont. I had never been here before, had no reason to be in Vermont at all, but my eyes felt like sandpaper, my body screaming for rest. The motel's faded vacancy sign flickered erratically, buzzing like a dying insect. There was something unsettling about it, about the entire place, really. The single-story structure stretched along the lot in an L shape, the exterior paint peeling in long strips, revealing rotting wood underneath. A cracked neon sign above the office window hummed weakly, casting a dull red glow onto the pavement. There were no other cars in the lot. Inside, the motel office smelled like old coffee and something faintly chemical. A small, wall-mounted TV played static in the corner. Behind the counter, a man in a stained white polo sat motionless, his head tilted downward as if he had fallen asleep. The only light came from a cheap desk lamp, illuminating the thin film of dust coating the countertop. I cleared my throat. "Hey, I need a room for the night." The man didn't move. I shifted uncomfortably, tapping my knuckles against the counter. "Sir?" His head snapped up. The movement was too sudden, too stiff. His eyes were glassy, pupils too large, and for a split second, I had the sickening thought that something was wrong with him, something wrong in a way I didn't have words for. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I forced a laugh. "Yeah, well, I'm too tired to drive." His lips parted like he wanted to say something else, but then he simply reached beneath the counter, pulled out a key, and set it down between us. The keychain was an old plastic rectangle, faded from years of handling. Room 306 was written in black marker on a piece of paper, taped crudely inside the keychain's plastic window. "I only need it for a few hours," I said, fishing a crumpled 20 from my pocket. The man stared at the bill like it was a foreign object. "Cash only," he murmured. I hesitated. "That is cash." He looked at me then, really looked at me. Something about his expression made the hairs on my arms prickle. There was something wrong with his face. The skin seemed too tight. His mouth twitched slightly, like he was suppressing something. Laughter? A grimace? The muscles around his jaw kept shifting, almost as if something beneath his skin was moving. Slowly, he took the money and slid the key toward me. "Room 306, he said again, as if he was warning me. Outside, the air was damp, thick with the scent of wet pavement and something else, something metallic. The lot was still empty. My car was the only one parked in front of the row of identical doors. A few of the rooms had their curtains drawn, but most of the windows were black, empty. A low hum filled the air, and for a moment, I thought it was coming from the neon sign. But as I stepped toward my room, I realized the sound wasn't electrical. It was coming from inside the motel. A low, wet humming. I pushed the thought away. Exhaustion was making me paranoid. Room 306 was at the far end of the lot, near the back where the overhead lamps didn't quite reach. The door was painted dull blue, a large gouge in the wood near the handle. Someone had kicked this door in at some point. I tried not to think about that as I pushed the key into the lock. Inside, the air smelled stale, like mildew and something else, something sweet and rotten. The walls were covered in thin, yellowing wallpaper, the kind that had probably been peeling for decades. A small CRT television sat on a wooden dresser, the screen dark. The bed, covered in a floral comforter, sagged in the middle. The carpet was damp. I dropped my bag onto the table near the window, locking the door behind me. The latch felt weak. I didn't like that. Then, somewhere behind the wall, a dull, heavy thud. I stopped. Listened. Silence. Then, another thud. I swallowed, stepping closer to the wall. The sound had come from the room next door. It was louder this time, a deep, wood impact. A shifting sound followed, like something dragging across the carpet. My mind immediately reached for an explanation, maybe just an old heating system kicking on, maybe someone tossing in their sleep. And then, barely audible over the buzzing of the motel lights, I heard it. Humming. A slow, rhythmic tune, rising and falling in a breathy whisper. The sound was muffled by the wall, but I could tell, whoever was humming, they were right up against the other side of the wall. The tune was familiar but wrong, offbeat, as if someone was trying to mimic a song they barely remembered. I turned my head slightly, trying to place it. My eyes flicked toward the nightstand. 3:06 a.m. The humming stopped. A long pause. Then, knocking. Not at my door. From inside the closet. The knock came again, 3 slow, deliberate taps, each one rattling the thin wood of the closet door. My breath caught in my throat. I was frozen, my mind grasping for logic, but nothing about this made sense. There was no way someone could be inside that closet. I had just walked in. I had seen the door. It was closed. No one could have slipped in behind me. I took a slow step forward, my shoes making a soft, sticky sound against the damp carpet. I reached out, fingers hovering just inches from the handle. Another knock, but this time it wasn't from the closet. It was from the wall. The one shared with room 308. I staggered back, my pulse hammering. The humming had started again, barely above a whisper, but now it was all around me. Not just through the wall, above, below. The ceiling, the floor. Something wasn't right with this place. I grabbed my bag, fumbled with the zipper, my shaking hands barely able to grip it. My keys, I just needed my car keys. I wasn't staying here. I was done. The moment I touched the zipper, the closet door burst open. I barely had time to register what I was looking at. Darkness, impossibly deep, stretching into something that shouldn't exist. There was no back wall, no shelves, no end. Just a gaping void. The air spilling out of it was wrong, humid and thick, carrying the scent of something that had been buried deep underground. And then, I saw it. A hand. No, not a hand. The shape of one. A shadow of fingers, curling at the edges like smoke, moving as though trying to grasp something unseen. It wasn't attached to anything. It just hung there, floating in the blackness. The humming grew louder. The fingers twitched. And then, a whisper. Right against my ear. Don't turn around. I didn't think. I ran. I tore through the motel room, wrenching the door open so hard the handle nearly came off in my grip. The hallway was empty. Silent. The buzzing of the motel sign was gone. I didn't stop. I sprinted down the corridor, my footsteps thudding against the grimy carpet. My car, I just had to get to my car. I could see it outside the office, sitting under the flickering light. I was almost at the door when I heard it. A voice, low, crackling, like something straining through static. You forgot your key. I skidded to a stop. The motel clerk was standing behind the counter. Something was wrong. His head, too still. His eyes, wide and vacant, staring at me without blinking. His mouth stretched into a thin, unnatural grin. And in his hand, my room key. I hadn't brought it with me. It was still in room 306. You should take it, he said, his voice too flat. Too hollow. Behind me, down the hallway, the humming started again. And this time, it was coming closer. I didn't move. The motel clerk stood behind the counter, still holding my key. His fingers curled too tightly around the plastic tag, knuckles stiff and pale, as if he'd been gripping it for hours. His grin hadn't faded. It was stretched, wrong, frozen in place, like someone had taught him how to smile but forgot to tell him when to stop. The air in the office felt heavier, pressing in on me, as if the walls were closer than they had been a moment ago. The buzzing light fixture overhead drilled into my skull. The clerk wasn't blinking. His wide, vacant stare locked onto me, his grin twitching at the corners, as if he were waiting for something. I wanted to ignore him, keep moving, but behind me, the humming was growing louder, not just humming anymore, footsteps. They were slow, uneven, coming down the hallway with an irregular rhythm that sent a cold spike through my gut. I forced my mouth to work, my throat tightening as I formed the words. "Who's in room 308? I managed, my voice sounding weaker than I wanted it to. The man's grin widened, his lips stretching just a little too far, almost as if something behind his face was pulling at them like a puppet string. His voice, flat and hollow, barely more than a breath, carried across the desk like a whispered secret. "There is no room 308. My stomach dropped as I took a step back, my muscles tensing with the instinct to flee. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I refused to believe what he was saying. I had heard something in that room. The knocking. The humming. It had been real, not my imagination, and now I was being told that the room didn't exist. I needed to go. Get to my car. Get on the road and never look back. But the moment my foot touched the tile, the humming stopped, and before I could react, the motel door behind me slammed shut with a force that sent a shockwave through my chest. I spun around, nearly tripping over myself as the blinds rattled against the glass. My reflection in the window looked wrong, stretched and warped, as if the glass wasn't really glass, but something thinner, something flexible, like a sheet of ice on the verge of breaking. The office suddenly felt too small, the air too dense, my own breath too loud against the silence that followed the slamming door. Then I felt it, a shift in the air, something close, something behind me that hadn't been there a second ago. A breath, cold and deliberate, pressed against the back of my neck. I didn't think. I ran. I don't know why I did it, but I sprinted straight back into the hallway, back toward my room. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was the only familiar place in this nightmare of a building, but the second I rounded the corner, I knew I had made a mistake. The hallway wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood just outside room 306, facing the door, completely still. At first, I thought it was a man, but then I realized how wrong it was. Its posture wasn't natural. The head was tilted too far to the left, as if its neck had been broken and never set right, its arms limp at its sides with long, thin fingers twitching in slow, unnatural spasms. The skin, gray and sagging, clung too loosely to its frame, resembling wet paper soaked in ink. It wasn't moving, but it was listening. I stopped breathing, my vision tunneling as my pulse slammed against my ribs. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound, but the panic rising in my throat was making it impossible to think straight. The motel clerk had lied. Something was in room 308. The figure twitched, the jerking motion sharp and unnatural, as if something inside it had been wound too tight and the spring inside finally snapped. The humming started again, but this time it was deeper, stretched into something inhuman, vibrating through the floor and walls like an echo from a place that shouldn't exist. I turned to run, but the hallway was gone. My breath caught in my throat as I blinked, my stomach plummeting into freefall. I was still standing in the same place, but the motel had changed. The walls had disappeared. The floor beneath me was no longer the grimy motel carpet, but instead rotting wood, slick with moisture and soft beneath my shoes. There was no ceiling, no hallway, no sign of where I had just been, just a vast, endless blackness stretching out in every direction. The air was thick, almost suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on my skin like I had stepped into something ancient and waiting. Ahead of me, room 306 stood alone, but it wasn't my room anymore. The door was missing, the frame dark and hollow, the walls stripped bare, exposing beams warped with rot. From inside, something moved, shifting within the blackness beyond the doorway. My body locked in place as my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. There was a shape, a silhouette, blurred at the edges like smoke twisting in the air. No, not one. Many. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest, and then my foot hit something soft. The realization came slowly, my mind struggling to keep up, but when I finally looked down, I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. Fresh. Pressed deep into the rotting wood, standing right next to where I had just stepped. A voice whispered, too close to my ear. "You checked in." Another. Different this time, layered over the first, overlapping like voices tangled together in an old recording. Now you stay. A cold, claw-like hand clamped over my wrist and pulled me into the dark. The moment the hand closed around my wrist, my body went rigid. It wasn't just cold, it was wrong, like something that had never been alive but had learned how to pretend. My skin crawled as the pressure tightened, yanking me forward with unnatural force. My shoes skidded across the wet, rotting floor, the wood beneath me soft and unstable, and then suddenly, I wasn't standing anymore. I was falling. The darkness swallowed me whole. The air shifted around me, heavy and damp, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. My stomach twisted as I hit the ground hard, my shoulders slamming into the floor. The impact should have knocked the wind out of me, but there was no pain. No breathlessness. It was like my body had been pulled somewhere else, where normal rules didn't apply. I opened my eyes, but there was nothing, just a deep, smothering blackness stretching in every direction. No walls. No ceiling. No sound, except for the faintest, almost imperceptible hum. The same melody, slow and uneven, vibrating beneath my skin. I scrambled backward, my hands pressing into the floor, but instead of rotting wood, my fingers sank into something soft. Carpet. My breathing hitched as I realized I was sitting on the same floral motel carpet from before. My vision adjusted, the shapes around me pulling into focus. I wasn't in the endless void anymore, I was back inside room 306. The wallpaper was still peeling, the old CRT television still sitting dark on the dresser, the weak glow of the motel sign outside pushing dim red light through the thin curtains. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Except for one thing. The closet door was open. I pushed myself up, legs trembling beneath me, every instinct screaming that something was watching me. The air was thick, pressing down on me with something I couldn't name, something just beyond my understanding. I took a step toward the door, and that's when I saw it. The mirror. I hadn't noticed it before, mounted to the closet door, old and warped with age. The glass was speckled with black spots, the reflection slightly distorted, but I could still see myself. My chest rose and fell rapidly, my face pale, my hands shaking at my sides. But my reflection, it wasn't moving. I stopped breathing. The figure in the mirror, my reflection, was staring at me, but it wasn't mirroring my movements. It stood perfectly still, eyes too wide, too black, lips parted just slightly as if it was about to speak. My body locked in place as an unbearable tension filled the room. The humming, it was coming from the mirror now. A shape shifted behind my reflection, something tall and thin, its head tilted at the same unnatural angle as the thing in the hallway. My mind screamed at me to run, to move, to do anything, but my feet refused to work. My reflection's lips twitched, the corners stretching upward into an unnatural, twisted grin. The thing behind it leaned closer, pressing its face into the glass until I could see the details of it, skin like damp paper, eyes black and empty, mouth stretching too far across its face. Then, my reflection spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." My hand, burst through the glass. The impact shattered the mirror outward, sending shards flying as something grabbed me. The fingers locked around my wrist, identical to my own but colder, heavier, like dead weight. A force yanked me forward, pulling me toward the broken mirror, and the glass wasn't glass anymore. It was liquid, stretching and rippling like the surface of a lake, except it was black, endless, suffocating. I fought against it, digging my heels into the carpet, my free hand clawing at the dresser, the walls, anything to keep from being dragged inside. My own reflection, still grinning that awful, inhuman grin, stared back at me as if it was watching me struggle for its own amusement. The humming grew louder, the pressure against my wrist tightening until I swore I felt my bones begin to crack. Then, a knock. Not from the mirror. Not from inside the closet. From the door. The force yanking me forward stopped instantly, and in the sudden, crushing silence, I stumbled backward, my wrist freed. The mirror, still fractured and jagged, was normal again. No liquid. No hand reaching through. Just my reflection, now perfectly still, looking as shaken as I was. The knock came again. Slow. Heavy. 3 deliberate beats. I turned, pulse hammering against my ribs. The motel room door looked normal, closed, the cheap chain lock still in place. I crept forward, every inch of me screaming not to go near it, but something else, something deep, something primal, was drawing me closer. My fingers hovered over the handle, my breath coming in short gasps. Then, from the other side of the door, "Sir, is everything all right in there?" It was the motel clerk's voice. My throat went dry. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing, my hand still hovering over the lock. I wanted to answer. I wanted to tell him I needed help. But something stopped me. Something wasn't right. The clerk's voice, it was wrong. It wasn't muffled through the door like it should have been. It was too clear, too crisp, as if he was speaking inside the room with me. My skin prickled. My mind fought against the rising panic, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door didn't have a peephole. I had seen it when I came in. I had locked the chain myself. There was no way to see who was standing outside. But now, directly at my level, a peephole was there. And someone was staring through it. The eye, wide, bloodshot, surrounded by gray, sagging skin, wasn't blinking. It was pressed against the tiny glass circle, the pupil dilated, unfocused, watching me too intently. The voice came again, still from the other side, still inside the room at the same time. "Sir, let me in." I took a step back. "Sir, you forgot your key." Something pushed against the door from the other side. The chain lock snapped. I turned, sprinting for the bathroom, my mind barely processing the fact that I had nowhere to go. And behind me, the door creaked open. The door groaned as it swung open, slow and deliberate, the sound stretching into the silence like it was trying to drag the moment out. I didn't turn around, every part of me locked up, muscles seizing, lungs burning as I forgot how to breathe. Something had stepped into the room. I couldn't hear it move, couldn't see it, but the air changed, thickening around me, pressing against my back like a storm cloud before the first crack of thunder. The dim red glow of the motel sign flickered through the curtains, casting uneven shadows against the peeling wallpaper, but one of those shadows didn't belong. I took a step toward the bathroom, my bare foot sinking into the damp carpet, the fibers clinging to my skin like something alive, something waiting. My heartbeat was so loud now, pounding in my ears, muffling the outside world, the presence behind me still unmoving but close, closer than before, closer than it should be. The air in the room was dense, charged with something unseen, something waiting for me to acknowledge it, but I wouldn't. I couldn't. Then, a whisper, breathy and wrong, like someone trying to imitate human speech, slid through the heavy silence. "Sir, I have your key." The voice came from the door, but it also came from behind me, pressing against my ear with a cold, damp breath that sent a spike of nausea through my stomach. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move, my fingers reaching for the bathroom doorframe. My palms slid against the cheap wood, the texture rough beneath my sweat-slicked skin, every nerve screaming at me to move faster. I wasn't thinking anymore, just moving, surviving, needing a barrier, anything between me and the thing standing in my motel room. The moment my foot crossed into the bathroom, the air behind me shifted. The weight of the presence lifted, stepping back, letting me go, yet the relief I expected never came, replaced instead by a deeper sense of dread. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. I turned and slammed the bathroom door shut, twisting the lock with shaking fingers, the metallic click echoing in the tiny space. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than before, pressing against my skin like something alive, something coiling around me. My breath was uneven, too fast, my forehead pressed against the wood as sweat cooled on my skin. I wanted to believe the lock would keep it out, that a flimsy piece of metal could hold back whatever had stepped into my room, but I knew better. A slow, deliberate scratching sound crept along the door, not a knock, not a fist, but fingernails. They traced along the wood, stopping near the lock, hesitating as if testing the barrier between us before dragging downward again. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms as I tried to slow my breathing, tried to keep quiet, but it didn't matter. It already knew I was here. The bathroom light flickered once, buzzing weakly before stabilizing, casting a pale, lifeless glow against the cracked tiles. I swallowed the lump in my throat and turned, forcing myself to face the mirror above the sink. The edges of the glass were darkened with age, the surface slightly warped, fractures running through it like veins. My reflection stood there, chest rising and falling, eyes wide, face pale and damp with sweat, but something about it felt off. My stomach twisted with an unease I couldn't quite place, my pulse stuttering as I leaned closer. Then, my reflection stopped moving. I inhaled sharply, watching as my chest continued to rise and fall, my breath shallow and ragged, yet the version of me in the mirror remained completely still, locked in place, its body stiff, head tilted just slightly to the right. My own breath didn't match, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs, but my reflection was frozen, staring back at me with something unnatural hiding behind its glassy eyes. Then, its mouth twitched. A slow, unnatural smile stretched across its face, too wide, the corners pulling almost to its ears, the skin at the edges of its lips cracking, splitting apart like something wearing my face as a mask. My stomach lurched, my breath catching in my throat as the reflection lifted its hand, fingers curling, waving at me in slow motion. I didn't move. I couldn't. My own arms were locked at my sides, my hands numb, the weight of my own body unfamiliar, but in the mirror, my hand continued to rise. Then I saw it. Thick, black veins crawled up its wrist, stretching beneath the skin like cracks in ice, jagged and unnatural, reaching toward its fingers like something growing. My throat tightened as an unbearable heat spread up my own arm, the pressure beneath my skin pulsing, throbbing, twisting through my veins. It wasn't just in the mirror. It was happening to me. Panic surged through me as I tore my gaze away from the glass, my free hand clawing at my wrist, desperate to stop whatever was spreading, but the moment I looked back up, my reflection was gone. The mirror stood empty, warped and cracked, but I wasn't there anymore. My stomach turned violently, a sickening dread gnawing deep in my chest, because if I wasn't in the mirror, then where was I? A voice, wet and slow, curled around my ear, sliding beneath my skin. You don't need the mirror anymore. The light flickered once, buzzing weakly overhead before cutting out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. The humming started again, vibrating through the walls, beneath the floor, inside my skull, crawling beneath my skin like something alive, something pushing into the spaces where I had existed a moment before. My hands trembled as I reached blindly for the door, fingers fumbling over the cold metal handle. I twisted it hard, yanking at the lock, but it wouldn't turn, wouldn't budge, the entire frame shifting against my weight. Then, something grabbed my wrist. I choked on a scream as an unbearably cold grip tightened around my arm, yanking me backwards so hard my feet left the ground. My shoulder hit the tiled floor with a sickening crack, my other arm flailing, clawing for anything to hold on to. My vision blurred, the air around me turning thick, humid, damp against my skin, the walls stretching, darkening, warping into something else, something that wasn't a bathroom anymore. The mirror. It wasn't empty anymore. My reflection was back. But I wasn't in it. It stood there, in the glass, still watching me, still smiling, but my body, my real body, was missing. The black veins crawled higher, creeping past my elbow now, my bones aching under the pressure, the weight of something else pressing into my skin, stretching through my limbs, claiming them. My legs spasmed as I kicked, trying to shake free of the force dragging me into the dark, but the grip on my wrist tightened, pulling. The thing in the mirror tilted its head. Its lips parted. And in a voice that was almost mine, it whispered, "You checked in." The light flickered one last time. Darkness swallowed me whole. The darkness wasn't empty. It was thick, pressing against my skin, seeping into my lungs, wrapping around me like something alive. I wasn't standing anymore. I wasn't falling either. I was just floating, weightless in a space that shouldn't exist, with nothing beneath me, nothing above me, nothing anywhere. The pressure around my wrist was still there, ice cold and wrong, the grip tightening as if something beneath my skin was being pulled, stretched, unraveled thread by thread. My pulse hammered against my ribs, too fast, too erratic, a deep thrumming that vibrated in my skull, but my body didn't feel like mine anymore. I tried to scream, but there was no sound. No breath. No air. The humming was still there, though louder now, filling the space with a rhythmic, distorted melody. It was layered, voices overlapping, clashing against each other in an eerie, fragmented tune. I couldn't make out the words, but it didn't matter. I knew what it meant. It was welcoming me. I forced my hands to move, my fingers trembling as they clawed at the unseen grip on my arm. It wasn't skin. It wasn't solid. It was like grasping at a shadow, my fingers sinking into something that wasn't there, something that shifted and curled around my touch, pulling me deeper into the void. My mind screamed at me to wake up, to move, to fight, but my limbs felt distant, unresponsive, as if I had already been separated from them, as if they belonged to something else now. Then, suddenly, light. It started as a sliver, a thin crack of something beyond the void, appearing beneath me like a distant, flickering shape. It stretched wider, opening, peeling away the darkness, revealing a floor. I slammed into it, my body crashing down with a force that rattled through my bones. The impact sent a sharp jolt through my spine, knocking the breath back into my lungs. My chest heaved, my fingers twitching against the carpet, my body regaining sensation all at once in a flood of searing pain. I gasped, coughing violently, the taste of something metallic coating my tongue. It took several long, shuddering breaths before I realized where I was. I was back in room 306. The dim glow from the parking lot outside filtered through the curtains, casting pale yellow light across the floral comforter, the old television, the wooden dresser with its peeling veneer. The hum of the motel sign buzzed faintly through the window, rhythmic and steady, like nothing had happened, like I had never left. But I had. I knew I had. And I wasn't alone. The air in the room was different, heavy, thick with the lingering scent of something rotting beneath the surface. My muscles screamed as I pushed myself up, my hands gripping the carpet, nails scraping against the fibers as I turned my head. That's when I saw it. The bathroom door was open. The mirror was still there, cracked at the edges, warped from age, but something was wrong with it. The reflection wasn't mine. It stood there, in the glass, a shape identical to me, but still, too still, watching. Its head was tilted slightly, its lips parted just enough to reveal teeth, too white, too sharp, too many. My chest tightened. I had seen this before. I had already been here. Then the reflection moved. Not like a normal reflection. Not mirroring me. It took a step forward, its bare feet silent against the tile bathroom floor, closing the distance between us, while I remained frozen, trapped, unable to breathe. My own face stared back at me, but the eyes were right. The black veins stretched farther now, creeping past the jawline, disappearing beneath the collar of its shirt, my shirt. It was wearing my clothes. I couldn't move. My body refused to listen. The reflection smiled, slow and deliberate, a movement that shouldn't have been possible, shouldn't have belonged to me. Its lips stretched too wide, the corners curling unnaturally, splitting slightly at the edges, but there was no blood. Just emptiness beneath the skin, a hollow space where something else had taken root. Then it spoke. I checked out. My pulse slammed against my ribs. My fingers dug into the carpet, but I was stuck, my body locked in place as if something was keeping me still, holding me in this moment, in this room, in this body that no longer felt like mine. The reflection's smile widened. You stayed. I shook my head, breath hitching, a choked sound clawing up my throat. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. I was awake. I was back. I had escaped. But deep down, beneath the panic, beneath the terror rising in my chest, I knew the truth. I never left. I had only traded places. A loud knock shattered the silence. I jerked at the sound, my body lurching forward as if the force holding me in place had suddenly let go. My breathing came ragged and uneven, my limbs weak as I turned my head toward the door. The knock came again, slow, deliberate, 3 heavy beats against the wood. I knew who it was. The motel clerk. The same man who had checked me in. The one who had stood behind the counter with his too wide smile, watching me, waiting for me to understand why I shouldn't be here. "Sir," the voice called from the other side. "Is everything all right in there?" My throat locked up. I couldn't answer. My eyes flicked back to the mirror, but the reflection was gone. Just an empty, cracked surface, warped and discolored, showing only the dim light of the bathroom. But I didn't trust it. I knew it was still there. The knock came a third time, harder now, more urgent. I pushed myself up, my legs trembling as I stumbled toward the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the lock. Maybe this was over. Maybe someone could get me out of here. Maybe the motel clerk had been trying to warn me from the beginning. My fingers hesitated over the latch. Then I saw it. The peephole. It hadn't been there before. I had seen the door when I first arrived, had locked the chain myself, had checked. There had been no way to see outside, no tiny glass circle where I could look through. But now, there it was. And someone was staring back at me. The eye pressed against the glass was wide and bloodshot, surrounded by skin that was too gray, too sagging, too dead. It wasn't blinking. The voice came again, but this time it was inside the room with me. "Sir, let me in." My breath hitched, my fingers ripping away from the lock. Something pushed against the door. The chain rattled. The metal bent. Then, with a sickening snap, the lock broke, and the door began to swing open. The door swung open slowly, the metal latch snapping like brittle bone, the chain lock hanging loose, twisted at an impossible angle. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as the dim yellow light from the motel hallway seeped into the room. The shadows stretched unnaturally, bending and curling along the walls as if they were alive, reaching for me with fingers that didn't belong to anything I could see. The air turned thick, damp, pressing against my skin like a second layer, suffocating and cloying, thick with the scent of something old and wet. The motel clerk stood in the doorway. His posture was stiff, his head tilted slightly, the same way the thing in the mirror had tilted mine. His eyes were right, too wide, too glassy, the pupils dilated into perfect black circles. His mouth hung open just slightly, not enough to be speaking, but enough to reveal his teeth, as if he had been caught mid-grin and forgotten how to close his lips again. He wasn't moving, wasn't blinking, just standing there, watching me. "Sir," he finally said, the word stretched and wrong, an echo of something human, but lacking the weight of real speech. The way his lips moved didn't match the sound, like he was struggling to remember how a mouth was supposed to work. "Is everything all right in there?" My body locked up, my mind screaming at me to run, to get as far from this place as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing inward, the air crushing my ribs in a slow, agonizing grip. The motel clerk took a step forward, and his shadow didn't follow him properly. It lagged behind, stretching unnaturally across the carpet, too long, too disjointed, the limbs bending in places where he had no joints. He took another step. I stumbled backward, my heel catching against the damp carpet, my balance nearly giving out beneath me. The bed was right behind me, the mattress pressing into the backs of my legs, stopping me from moving any farther. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs as I forced my mouth to work. "You need to leave," I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. The motel clerk blinked, once, slow and deliberate, like it was something he had forgotten how to do and had just now remembered. His grin stretched wider. His lips split at the corners, a thin line of something dark seeping into the creases of his skin. He took another step. "Sir," he repeated, voice lower now, slower. "You forgot your key." He lifted his hand. The key dangled from his fingers. My key. The same cheap plastic rectangle, the same faded handwriting spelling out room 306, the same one I had left inside when I ran. But I hadn't given it to him. He shouldn't have it. He couldn't have it. The humming started again. It came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the floor, through the walls, seeping into the air itself. The lights in the room flickered, the motel sign outside buzzing louder, the weak glow pulsing erratically through the curtains. My stomach twisted violently as the motel clerk took another slow step forward, the shadows behind him warping, stretching toward me. My fingers scrambled against the bedspread, gripping the fabric, my entire body locking up as he leaned forward. His breath hit my face, damp and stale, tinged with something metallic and wrong. The black veins that I had seen in my reflection, they were crawling up his neck now, branching out across his jawline, pulsing beneath his skin like something alive. I had to move. I had to get out. The motel clerk tilted his head again, his lips parting just slightly, the grin never fading. Then, with a voice that was too many voices at once, layered and discordant, he whispered, "You never checked out." I lunged for the door. My shoulder hit his chest, my entire body crashing into him as I shoved my way forward. His skin wasn't right, too cold, too soft, like pressing against something that had been soaked in water for too long. I gagged, my fingers slipping against the damp fabric of his shirt as I shoved him aside, my feet barely catching against the floor as I ran. The hallway wasn't the same. It stretched too far in both directions, longer than it had been before, the walls bending inward, the light fixtures flickering weakly against the stained ceiling. The doors to the other rooms were open now. They hadn't been before. When I arrived, every room had been dark, empty, the windows black. But now I could see them. Figures stood in each doorway, watching me. They weren't moving. They weren't breathing. Their faces were hollow, the black veins spreading from their mouths, their eyes, creeping along their skin like something was inside of them, something that had hollowed them out and left only this. The humming was louder now, rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic pulse, their heads tilting in unison, following me as I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The exit sign at the end of the hall flickered, the word barely visible beneath the grime-coated glass. I ran toward it, my breath burning in my lungs, my vision tunneling as the walls closed in, the figures stepping forward now, moving in slow, shuddering motions, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. The motel clerk's voice followed me, crawling up the walls, curling beneath the sound of the humming. "You forgot your key." My fingers slammed against the door handle. It wouldn't turn. I pulled harder, panic crashing over me in thick, choking waves, my breath ragged, my hands slick with sweat as I twisted the knob again and again. The humming was right behind me now, pressing against my back, the air thick with something I couldn't name. Then, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed, my body twisting violently, my arms swinging out as I ripped away from the grip, my foot slamming against the door. The wood splintered beneath the impact, the lock giving way, the entire frame shaking as I threw myself forward. And suddenly, I was outside. The motel parking lot stretched before me, empty, the weak glow of the street lamps flickering against the cracked pavement. My car was still there, sitting exactly where I had left it, the windows dark, the doors unlocked. The motel loomed behind me, its neon sign still buzzing, still flickering. But something was wrong. The humming was gone. The air was still. The motel clerk, he wasn't there anymore. The hallway behind me had disappeared. The doorway I had just come through was gone. There was no entrance. No lobby. No motel office. Just a wall. A solid, windowless wall where the doorway should have been. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, my legs trembling beneath me. My fingers dug into my arms as I gripped myself, forcing my mind to catch up, forcing myself to accept what I was seeing. There was no way back inside. The motel had swallowed itself. I wasn't supposed to leave. I turned, running toward my car, my hands fumbling for my keys as my body screamed for escape. I yanked the driver's side door open, throwing myself inside, my fingers slamming against the ignition. The engine sputtered, the old frame shaking violently as the car roared to life. In the rearview mirror, something stood where the motel used to be. It was watching me. And it was smiling. The engine roared as I jammed the car into gear, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. The tires screeched against the pavement as I tore out of the parking lot, the weak glow of the motel's neon sign shrinking in my rearview mirror. The figure that had been standing there, watching me, grew smaller, but it didn't move. It just stood motionless in the dark, the grin still stretched too wide across its face, its body blending into the shadows like it was part of the night itself. I didn't look again. I couldn't. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, my chest tight as I pressed harder on the gas, pushing the speedometer past 60, then 70, then 80. The road was empty, endless, stretching forward into nothing but black highway and the occasional flickering street lamp. The town was gone. No buildings, no side streets, just road. It didn't make sense. My knuckles turned white against the wheel as I forced myself to think, to make sense of what had happened. The motel had been there. I had checked in. I had been inside. The humming, the clerk, the mirror, none of it could have been real, but the weight of it still clung to me, wrapping around my ribs, squeezing the breath from my lungs. My reflection. The voice. The way it smiled at me. I pressed a trembling hand to my wrist where it had grabbed me, expecting to feel bruises, an imprint of something unnatural left behind, but my skin was smooth. No marks. No evidence that anything had ever touched me. The only proof that I had been there was the sweat dampening my shirt, the cold panic coiling in my stomach. Then, from somewhere beneath the engine's hum, the humming started again. A deep, low vibration, buried beneath the sound of the tires against the asphalt, barely noticeable at first. My breath hitched, my hands tightening on the wheel, my pulse quickening as I realized what I was hearing. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the back seat. My body locked up, every muscle seizing, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't look. I couldn't look. The weight of something wrong pressed against my spine, coiling around the back of my neck, something heavy, something that shouldn't be there. The humming rose and fell in slow, steady waves, distorted, layered, like more than one voice was singing. I pressed harder on the gas, the speedometer climbing, the car rattling beneath me as the world outside stayed the same. The same stretch of road, the same flickering lights, no towns, no intersections. No end. A whisper slipped through the air, so close it skimmed my ear. You never checked out. My body reacted before my brain did. My hands yanked the wheel to the right, tires screeching as the car spun off the road. The frame lurched sideways, my seatbelt locking up, my head snapping forward as the vehicle skidded onto the shoulder, gravel kicking up against the windows. For a second, everything went silent. Then, the engine sputtered and died. The world settled. The humming was gone. I sat there, heart slamming against my ribs, breath ragged, hands gripping the wheels so hard my fingers ached. My mind screamed at me to move, to get out, to run, but I couldn't. The weight in the back seat was still there. Slowly, with a force that made my skin crawl, I reached for the rearview mirror, my fingers shaking as I tilted it downward. My stomach twisted so violently I thought I might throw up. The back seat was empty. No one was there. But the indentation in the seat remained. A deep impression in the fabric, like someone had been sitting there the whole time. The air was colder now, thick with the scent of something damp, metallic, like the smell of the motel room before it changed. I forced a breath into my lungs, my fingers trembling as I reached for the keys, jamming them into the ignition. The engine didn't turn over. A flicker of movement caught my eye. The rearview mirror. For the briefest second, less than a blink, I saw my own face staring back at me. But it wasn't me. It was smiling. Then the mirror cracked. A loud, sharp snap, spiderwebbing across the glass like something had struck it from the inside. My breath hitched. My hands flew off the wheel, my body recoiling as I watched the cracks spread outward in a slow, deliberate crawl. The reflection distorted, twisting at impossible angles, shifting like it was still watching me even though the lines had fractured its face. The hum started again. Not from behind me. From inside the mirror. My stomach dropped. The mirror shook, vibrating against the frame, the cracks deepening, splitting wider and wider, the glass buckling as if something beneath it was trying to push through. A voice, layered, discordant, wrong, slipped through the cracks. You forgot your key. The glass shattered. The explosion sent shards flying across the car, scattering across the dashboard, the seat, my lap, the edges catching my skin, small cuts blooming across my arms. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at the broken fragments, my own reflection splintered into 100 twisted versions of myself. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a knock. Slow. Deliberate. Right against the driver's side window. I turned my head. A figure stood just outside the car. Tall. Too tall. Its head tilted, skin pale and stretched too thin, the mouth open in a too wide grin, revealing rows of too white teeth. Its hands pressed against the glass, long fingers curled against the window, nails blackened, cracked, the skin around them peeling. My pulse slammed against my ribs as I tried to breathe, tried to move, but my body was frozen. It knocked again. Then, with a voice I knew too well, layered with my own, with the motel clerks, with all of them, it whispered, "Let me in." I screamed. My hands flew to the keys, twisting hard, the engine stalling, the battery clicking, the headlights flickering in and out. The figure didn't move. It just watched. Grinning. Waiting. The moment my foot slammed against the gas, the engine roared to life. And the figure was gone. The car shot forward, tires screeching against the pavement as I tore down the highway, my hands shaking, my breath coming in uneven bursts. The cracked rearview mirror trembled with every bump in the road, distorting my reflection, stretching my face into something I no longer recognized. The humming hadn't stopped. It was inside me now. And somewhere, in the distance, barely above the rush of the wind, the voice whispered one last time, "You're almost home." The highway stretched on, endless and empty, a black void cutting through the night. The speedometer climbed past 90, the car shaking beneath me, the engine rattling like it might tear itself apart, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. My breath was ragged, my pulse slamming against my ribs, my fingers locked in a death grip around the wheel. The humming was still there, inside me now, crawling beneath my skin, pulsing through my veins in time with my heartbeat. I refused to look at the rearview mirror again. The cracks were still spreading, distorting my reflection, bending it into something that wasn't me anymore. I could feel it watching, feel the weight of its gaze pressing against the back of my skull, feel the smile stretching across a mouth that wasn't mine. Every part of me screamed to throw the mirror off the windshield, to rip it away and never look again, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The motel had let me go, but something had followed. The road didn't look right. There were no mile markers, no signs, no towns. Just the same stretch of cracked asphalt, the same dead trees lining the shoulder, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The world outside the windows had gone wrong, stretching out in a way that made my stomach twist, like I was driving in a loop but never turning. Then, up ahead, headlights. A flicker of relief crashed through my chest. Another car. A real person. I wasn't alone. My fingers clenched around the wheel as I pressed harder on the gas, the car lurching forward, my foot shaking against the pedal. The headlights drew closer, growing brighter, the faint outline of a vehicle taking shape in the dark. A black sedan. It was driving toward me. My pulse stuttered, a cold spike of dread locking my spine in place. The sedan wasn't in the opposite lane. It wasn't coming from the other direction. It was moving in perfect sync with my own car, headlights pointed forward, speed matching mine exactly, the front bumper just barely visible past my own hood. My fingers went numb as my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. I slammed the brakes. The sedan stopped too. A sharp, gut-wrenching stillness filled the space between us. The night was too quiet, the road humming beneath the tires, but there was no wind, no insects, no sound. Just the low, pulsing thrum inside my own body, still vibrating beneath my ribs, twisting into something that wasn't mine anymore. The sedan's driver's side door opened. A figure stepped out. I knew before I saw its face. I had been running from it all night. Tall. Too tall. Its posture was stiff, its movements deliberate, as if every step was calculated, practiced. The dim glow of my own headlights illuminated its face, stretching the shadows across its too thin skin, the black veins pulsing beneath the surface. Its lips curled into a too wide smile, familiar and impossible. It was me. I couldn't breathe. My lungs locked up, my vision tunneling, the weight of it pressing against my chest like something was wrapping around my ribs. The thing that looked like me, the thing that had watched me from the mirror, that had whispered to me from the motel room, that had followed me out of the place I never should have entered, was standing right in front of me now. And it was waiting. The humming grew louder. The world rippled around it, the trees warping, the road blurring like a photograph that had been burnt at the edges. The figure's head tilted, just slightly, its smile never faltering. Then, it raised a hand. My own hand. My fingers twitched against the wheel as a deep, suffocating pull wrapped around my wrist, the same way it had in the bathroom, in the hallway, in the dark place where the motel had swallowed me whole. This was it. It wasn't just following me. It had caught up. The figure took a step forward. I slammed my foot against the gas pedal. The tires screamed against the asphalt as the car shot forward, the headlights blurring, the world twisting as I plowed straight through the figure in the road. For half a second, I felt resistance. Then, nothing. The car jerked violently to the side, the wheel twisting beneath my hands as the world tilted. I barely had time to register the impact before the entire vehicle went airborne, the windows shattering, the metal frame collapsing inward as the car flipped. My body slammed against the ceiling, the airbag exploding into my chest, my limbs twisting at impossible angles as glass rained down like teeth. And then, silence. I couldn't see. Couldn't move. My ribs ached, my lungs heaving, the scent of burnt rubber and gasoline filling my nose, thick and suffocating. My fingers twitched against the broken seatbelt, the weight of my body pressing sideways into the crushed door. The road was gone. The headlights flickered, casting a dim glow against the trees, but they weren't the same trees. They were taller now. Twisted, skeletal things stretching upward into an endless, dark sky, their gnarled branches curving like fingers. The air was damp, thick with something I didn't want to name. The car had stopped moving, the engine choking on its last breath, the metal groaning as it settled into whatever place I had landed. I wasn't on the highway anymore. I wasn't anywhere anymore. The humming had stopped. Something knocked against the windshield. Once. Twice. Slow. Deliberate. My body refused to move, every nerve frozen in place as I forced my eyes open, forced myself to look. Something stood outside the wreckage. Not me this time. Something else. Something older. Something that had been waiting. The last thing I saw before the light flickered out completely was a hand, long fingers pressing against the shattered glass, nails blackened, cracked, the skin around them peeling. The darkness swallowed everything in an instant. And a voice whispered, low and final. Time to check in. The darkness wasn't empty. It pulsed around me, thick and suffocating, wrapping around my limbs like something living, pressing against my skin in slow, deliberate waves. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. My mind screamed, but my body refused to listen, frozen in the wreckage, tangled in metal and shattered glass. The last sound I heard was the distant ringing of my own heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, a perfect match to the humming that had followed me all night. Then, slowly, the world shifted. The weight against my chest eased, the thick scent of gasoline and burned rubber fading into something else, something damp, stale, filled with the lingering scent of mildew and old carpet. My body sank, the sharp edges of twisted steel and shattered glass melting away, the sensation of broken ribs and bruised limbs dissolving like mist. The wreckage was gone. I was somewhere else now. A dull buzzing filled the air, crackling through the walls like an old neon sign struggling to stay lit. The sound was familiar. Too familiar. My stomach clenched, my fingers twitching against the surface beneath me, soft, slightly damp fabric, the texture worn and threadbare. My heart stopped. I knew this place. My eyes snapped open. Room 306. The floral comforter beneath me was the same one I had seen before, the cheap wooden dresser, the buzzing motel sign outside the window casting dim, pulsing red light across the walls. The mirror across the room stood cracked at the edges, the glass warped with age, reflecting only a dark, hollowed-out version of the space I was in. I sat up too fast. My breath hitched, my head spinning as the unmistakable feeling of déjà vu slammed into me. This wasn't possible. I had left. I had escaped. I had been on the road, had seen the thing in the mirror, had crashed. I reached for my wrist instinctively, fingers pressing against my skin where the thing had grabbed me, expecting bruises, expecting pain, but there was nothing. Smooth, unmarked flesh. No proof of what had happened. No evidence that I had ever left this room at all. A sick, curling dread twisted in my gut as I turned toward the nightstand. The alarm clock sat there, digital numbers glowing dull red, blinking 3:06 a.m. The same time as before. As if no time had passed at all. The humming started again. Soft at first, drifting through the thin motel walls, seeping through the air like fog, pressing against my skin in slow, deliberate pulses. My chest tightened, my fingers digging into the blanket as I turned my head toward the closet door. It was open. A sliver at first, just barely cracked, but as I stared, it moved. The door creaked forward, inch by inch, revealing nothing but blackness beyond the threshold. The darkness inside was different. Not empty. A shape shifted within the shadows, something tall and waiting, its outline stretching, its body just barely visible in the dim motel glow. My throat went dry. It had never let me go. I had never left. A whisper curled through the air, soft, almost gentle. "Welcome back." The closet door swung open all the way. And then, I saw it. Not just a reflection. Not just a shadow. Me. Standing in the darkness. Same clothes. Same face. Same wide, stretched smile. The black veins crept up its neck, branching along its skin, its fingers twitching at its sides like they were remembering how to move. It didn't blink. Didn't breathe. It just stood there, grinning at me with that same too wide, too human, too wrong expression. I tried to move. Tried to force my body out of the bed, toward the door, toward anything but this. But my limbs wouldn't work. I was frozen, locked in place as the humming grew louder, vibrating through my bones, through my skull, turning my vision dark at the edges. My reflection, the thing wearing my face, stepped forward. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't breathe. It sat on the bed across from me, slow and deliberate, mirroring my posture, its head tilting in perfect time with mine. My chest seized, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs, my mind screaming that this wasn't real, this couldn't be real, but the weight of it pressed against me, the presence in the room growing stronger. The motel had never let me leave. The figures in the hallway. The clerk at the front desk. The thing in the mirror. They had all been warnings, and I had ignored them. I had checked in. And now, I would never check out. My reflection leaned closer. And with my own voice, it whispered, "Your turn." The motel door creaked open behind me. The last thing I felt was the weight of something cold wrapping around my wrist, pulling me backward, yanking me out of myself as my reflection took my place. My body lurched, the world twisting, my limbs locking up as the air around me went impossibly still. Then, darkness. Nothingness. And in the distance, a knock at the door.